Mark the fourth anniversary of the war in Iraq. During this portion, an economist, journalist, and historian talk about the war's costs. It's about an hour and 10 minutes.
Good morning. I'm Chuck Sturzier. I want to welcome you to our teach-in on the Iraq War 4 years later. Younger people especially have been asking me often in the last few weeks, what's a teach-in, Chuck? And I've told them that it's not the same as a class or a seminar or a conference. Those familiar and justifiably precious experiences in academia are ones that try to expand knowledge and search for truth in an open, honest, and intelligent way. That's also our goal today. But after 4 years of lies and deceit about this war, a grand propaganda ruse about WMD, the death of now more than 3,000 American soldiers and some 650,000 Iraqis in what has become a bloodbath we have unleashed, complete obfuscation of our imperial plans in the Middle East, of coddling of Israel, of lies over the role of oil, of seeing our liberties eroded and Bush's mad and apocalyptic yearnings, and of the sniffling press never standing up to power. It is time, indeed past time, to shift the name of our academic discourse from seminar to teach-in. The goal remains the expansion of knowledge and the search for truth. But what is added to a teach-in is the goal of consciousness raising. You must remove your blinders in the age of George Bush in order to see anything. A teach-in is fluid, maybe a little unruly. So God bless unruly. I'm sick to death of being ruled by old white men in dark suits and white shirts with little decal American flag pins on their suits. A teach-in is, I've been asked also a lot in the last few weeks, is a teach-in open and free? And I've always said, of course it's open. A teach-in is open to anybody, and we encourage anyone to come, even though we're living in chains in the Bush administration. Thomas Jefferson said that we need a revolution every 20 years. I think we're long overdue. I am an historian. I'm also a psychoanalyst. And the first principle of healing is do no harm. The Bush administration never learned this. We are now in much greater peril because of what this administration has done to fight terrorism than if they had done absolutely nothing in Iraq. Barack Obama said, I don't oppose all wars. What I am opposed to is a dumb war. Senator James Webb has said, we trusted the judgment of our national leaders. We owe them our loyalty as Americans and gave it. But they owed us sound judgment, clear thinking, concern for our welfare, and a guarantee that the threat to our country was equal to the price we might be called upon to pay in defending it. Instead, we are left with tears and death stretching to an indeterminate future. I'm also a military father. My oldest son was in the Gulf War on the front lines, in fact with the 7th Corps invading. And my youngest son is currently in the Army in Camp Anaconda near the Balad Air Force Base north of Iraq. My oldest son made it home fine, but I've often thought that life is filled with contradictions. And if my youngest son were killed in this rotten war, I don't know if I would ever fully recover. Can war ever be anything but rotten? Maybe. A free society needs its warriors, but it doesn't need cannon fodder to fight the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. I'm Michael Flynn. I'm the Associate Director of the Center on Terrorism, and Chuck and I have worked along with Andrea Matten to organize this event. I just have a couple comments at the beginning. I've always considered it a blessing that my children were spared teach-ins, frankly. This is from one of the many pro-war intellectuals who declined our invitation to participate in this event. An enthusiast of not only our invasion and occupation of Iran, he is also an advocate for expanding the war to include Iran and beyond. Given that he welcomed a future invitation to speak at a less politically charged event, I imagine that he thought this event would be more a carnival than a symposium. Given his neoconservative orientation, I imagine he was probably thinking that we were guilty of trying to resuscitate a regrettable practice from the tasteless and disastrous 1960s. In his mind, this event would most probably be deeply estranged from the principles of probity that he and his fellow think tank intellectuals deemed necessary for political discourse. I'm afraid, though, that the parties in this new century, given to excess and destructiveness, to extremism and prelection, are not those on the political left, nor the peace movement. But his response raises an interesting issue, something that requires addressing. Why sponsor such an event? At our center, we are quite clear that the university serves in the public trust. Given the zeal for privatization of just about everything, be it capital, education, urban space, transportation, incarceration, security, or war making, this may seem to be an antiquated or perhaps simply quaint notion. But it's something that we at CUNY hold fiercely dear. In her remarkable essay on truth and politics, Hannah Arendt comments on the readiness of politicians to lie. And this is a quote. Highly respected statesmen like de Gaulle and Adenauer have been able to build their basic principles on such evident non-facts as that France belongs among the victors of the last war and hence is one of the great powers, and that the barbarism of National Socialism had affected only a relatively small percentage of the country. All these lies, whether their authors know it or not, tend to violence and to destroy whatever it has decided to negate, although only totalitarian governments have consciously adopted lying as the first step to murder. Arendt's indictment of lionized figures is most instructive, as that it insists that falsity is not simply the province of the hack or the mouthpiece. The lies of the Bush administration belong to the realm of fantasy and legend. Unfortunately, we must contend with them in common time. This war has been underpropped and rationalized by a predatory swarm of lies, the consequences of which are still unfathomable. Arendt was also quite clear that modern society has two institutions dedicated to protecting and promoting truth. One is the judiciary, the other, the university. The efforts of the Bush administration to eviscerate the judiciary have been fully adumbrated and require contravention. The assault on the university has received far less coverage, but is no less dangerous. In Arendt's treatment of the modern political lie, she refers to lies regarding wartime conduct. Lies exaggerating one's military prowess or minimizing one's complicity with barbarism and cruelty. Lies that were adopted and accepted by a political and social structure that was democratic in name and principle. I mention this because I'm deeply disturbed about the widespread practices of cruelty and barbarism performed in the name of security. The torture, the rape, the murder, and the illegal detention of civilians, just to name a few. I would also include here the treatment of soldiers at VA hospitals throughout this nation, not just Walter Reed. Because cruelty is simply not the infliction of pain on another, but the indifference to the other's suffering and distress, especially when the suffering and pain are unnecessary. Throughout this day, our speakers will be very critical of American foreign policy, militarism, and the failures of the mainstream media and the lack of loyal political and social opposition. But this is not intended to be simply negative work. If we are to regain our standing as a decent nation in the community of nations, much has to be undone. Despite the claims of the militarists, the collapse of the Soviet Union was caused by the social innovation that was brought on by the lack of public and committed dissent and protest as any other factor. Democracy requires such practices, and any authentic affirmation requires critique. In his book, Official Knowledge, Democratic Education in a Conservative Age, Michael Apple writes, "A serious education cannot be neutral. It has to be based on a set of ethical principles and political principles, one that overcomes immobility and fatalism and enables learners to become subject of their own lives and histories." Given the mission of this College of Criminal Justice, we are particularly interested in protecting the principles that serve as the foundation of any open and civil society. We are also interested in addressing how the rule of law and justice can be reestablished in the wake of serious and sustained criminal activities. President Bush has stated that a college education, and here I quote, should teach respect and understanding and goodwill. Mr. Bush, I think, is suffering from diminished expectations. A college education must accomplish far more than this. At the very least, it should require the critical self-examination and examination of one's own cultural heritage and societal practices that serve as the prerequisite for what Martha Nussbaum has named world citizenship. It should also provide students with the tools to identify the structures of power and domination and cruelty and barbarism, and the courage to apprehend them when necessary. This, quite frankly, is the reason for this teaching.
Thank you. All right, we're going to begin with our first panel, the war and its costs. Jed Abrahamian has not shown up, so where's Jed? Oh, there's Jed. Oh, sorry, at the other end of the table. And the panel is with Ray McGovern, Chris Hedges, and Jed Abrahamian. Just very briefly, because we have slides sort of tell you as they talk who they are. That's the idea, to keep introductions to a minimum. Ray McGovern is a very, very distinguished ex-CIA agent, has become, he's on television every other day and in the New York Times, and is an important voice in this country for honesty from those, honesty and justice from within the community of those responsible for trying to keep us safe from dangers abroad. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, has written 2 path-breaking books, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, which has provided meaning to a whole generation of young people, I think, and his recent book, American Fascists, which I'm sure he'll talk about, and Jed Abrahamian, who's a historian of modern Iran. Jed and I have been on panels for about 20 years. Glad he made it. And so, without further ado, we'll take it in that order. Ray and Chris, Ray McGovern, Chris Hedges, and Ervan Abrahamian. You want, and you can either use the podium or not. You want to use the podium? Sure.
Good morning. I would be less than frank were I not to start out by saying how honored I feel to be on this distinguished panel. Take Chris, for example, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for the New York Times. My grandfather, who had a third-grade education in Ireland, used to still read the New York Times, as he put it, black and white, every day. I am reminded also of the temptation to feel a little bit too honored by being in such distinguished company. And I'm reminded of my grandmother, my Irish grandmother, who used to be very careful that her son not be put on the high hat. You see, he had a college education, like many of you do, and he got to be a lawyer, and then he got to be Chancellor of the Board of Regents. And as the State University limousine came to pick him up at our little place in the Bronx, she would yell after him, "Now, Joseph, don't put on the high hat." It's a historic day, folks. There will be a vote in the House of Representatives, and in the balance is whether we continue this war with another 1,000 or 2,000 U.S. young people killed or not. I think that there's a very clean way out of this. There's a provision that very courageous African-American representative from Oakland, California, Barbara Lee, who was the only one, incidentally, back in 2001, after 9/11, to vote against giving the president unlimited authority to wage war wherever. She's got a very sensible provision which says, sure, $100 billion, sure, fund it, but make sure that it is used exclusively to bring our troops home by the end of this year. Now, everyone agrees, everyone who's honest agrees that, defeat is not an option. It's a certainty. The way this thing has been run, the way it's been conceived on a pile of laws, it is a certainty. And for General Petraeus, who, quote, wrote the book, end quote, about insurgency, to go out there defying all his own guidelines, all his rules, it's just not possible to prevail, not even with 500,000 people. And people don't realize that, people don't face up to that. Well, this confuses me. And one of the advantages of living in Washington is that you get a chance to bump into, literally, congressmen and senators just walking around town, which I did 2 Sundays ago. A very experienced, prominent congressman. We had brunch. And I said, tell me, please, tell me, what is it that makes the Pelosi's and the others of this world, the Reeds, not face up to the real problem and get our people out of there? And he looked at me and he said, Ray, listen, I want you to listen to this. You've heard of the military-industrial complex? Well, it's real. It's real. You've heard of the Israel lobby? Ray, that's real. It's real. This was one of the congressmen who was responsible for putting in the bill a restriction on the president from waging war on Iran. And I said, well, good going. At least we got that in the bill. He said, "Not so fast, Ray. AIPAC, the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, so-called, is crawling all over the hill, and I expect that they will be able to get that out of the bill." 2 days later, Olmert, the Prime Minister of Israel, saw fit to instruct our congressman by live interview at the AIPAC conference, and he said, "Those who are concerned for Israel's security have to be against a quick departure of U.S. troops from Iraq. All of you who are concerned about the security," and I'm still quoting, "and the future of the state of Israel understand the importance of a strong American leadership addressing the Iranian threat as well. And I'm sure that you would not want to hamper or restrain that strong leadership unnecessarily." Hamper? Restrain? That provision simply mentioned the constitutional prerogative of the Congress to declare or otherwise authorize war. And this reminds me of Dean Rusk. Many of you too young to remember Dean Rusk, but he was Secretary of State in the 60s. And at one point when an Israeli foreign minister came in and gave him a lecture like this, this very mild-mannered Georgian sat back and he said, "You know, it's been bruited about by the Soviets and others that you're a colony of the United States, and we've all dispelled that illusion. But I would remind you that the United States is not a colony of Israel either." This is very serious business, folks. Rahm Emanuel, Steny Hoyer took their cue, they went to work, and AIPAC lobbying helped remove the provision from a bill that would have required President Bush to seek congressional approval for war against Iran. What am I reading from? JTA, the Global News Service of the Jewish people. I'm not making it up. So they're taking credit for this. Now, why do I home in on this? Because it's an issue that's highly relevant, and it has to do with both Iraq and Iran, as I think I've demonstrated, and it's different. And for some reason, it doesn't get discussed much. So I'm going to discuss it. Let's take off from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He's been very much in the news, hasn't he? Yesterday, I'm told by the Daily News that he confessed to being responsible for global warming. That's a joke. Well, you know, in the midst of the preparation of this 9/11 Commission cover-up report, he was captured. And the people drafting the report said, "Wow, it's our job to figure out why they did this, what motivated them. We got the mastermind, the mastermind that we've identified. Why don't we, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, why don't we ask him why he did it?" And so they did. And you all know what he said, right? What did he say? Anyone? Wow. You don't know what Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, said as to why he did it? Well, you can be excused, perhaps, because it's just one sentence in this 567-page report, and it appears on page 147. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had studied in North Carolina, at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, and the first notion was the analyst said, well, maybe he had a really bad experience with some girlfriend in Greensboro or something, or maybe he was given some reason not to like the United States. And so we have this very curious sentence on page 147. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's animus toward the United States stemmed not from his experiences there as a student, but rather from his violent disagreement with U.S. foreign policy favoring Israel. Whoops, wait a second. A little footnote here, footnote 7. Let's see here. I lost my glasses, I'm borrowing some here, but I think I can make this out. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's statements echo those of Ramzi Youssef, Khalid's nephew. He's the fellow that tried to knock down the Twin Towers in 93. Ramzi Youssef, who delivered an extensive polemic against U.S. foreign policy at his January 1998 sentencing, right in this city, I believe. But this doesn't help much, so I Googled Ramzi Youssef. What he said was, I'm proud to be condemned to 140 years in a federal prison because of my extreme hatred for my need to retaliate for the oppression of the Israelis that you, the United States, support. Okay, now what does this all mean? Well, it means that, we really have to look into this aspect of things, and that it's difficult to do, but if you're not running for anything, and if you don't need any contributions, I think your conscience impels you to address that, and that's why I'm doing it. These folks, the drafters of this report, did try to face into that, and it was really very interesting because it was awkward the way they tried to do it. They said, well, now, what are we going to do about the negative views of U.S. among Muslims, not only in the Middle East, but they noted that as of 2003, mind you, support for the U.S. or a favorable view of the U.S. had fallen in Indonesia from 61% to 15%, 1.5, okay? So the recommendation, the U.S. government must define what our message is, what we stand for. Next paragraph, some very brave soul said, well, American foreign policy is part of that message. Wow. American policy choices have consequences. Right or wrong, it is simply a fact that American foreign policy regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and American actions in Iraq are... Maybe you guys can finish that sentence. Here, I'll read it again. It is simply a fact that American policy regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and American actions in Iraq are part of the problem, huh? Well, no, you can't say it's part of the problem. This is what it goes on to say. These are, quote, dominant staples of popular commentary across the Arab and Muslim world, end quote. Talk about mealy-mouthed. Talk about being unable to call a spade a spade. I noticed that right off the bat, and now Lee Hamilton and Governor Kane have written a book. And the book is called Unprecedented? Okay. They're saying here that the commission disagreed as to how to characterize al-Qaeda's motives for attacking the U.S. Lee Hamilton argued that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the presence of U.S. forces in the Middle East were major contributors. Unidentified members believed that, quote, listing U.S. support for Israel as a root cause of al-Qaeda's opposition to the United States indicated, get this, indicated that the United States should reassess that policy, end quote, which those commission members did not want. Ultimately, the panel made a brief statement noting, the one sentence I read to you, that U.S. policy regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are, quote, dominant staples of popular commentary across the Arab and Muslim worlds. Folks, we have to face up to that. We have to recognize what the problem is. Part of the problem is, it's not the whole problem by any stretch, but it's a key part of it. And in closing, let me just kind of pick up our spirits a little bit, or at least try to. The old Hebrew prophet Elisha, I don't know if you remember, but when the king of Syria sent down his armies to arrest this guy, he and his servant were looking out, and the servant lost it. He said, what are we going to do? And do you remember what Elisha said? He said, no sweat. I don't know how that came across in Hebrew. He said, no sweat. There are more of us than there are of them. Look to the hills for the horses and chariots of fire. Folks, there are more of us than there are of them. I'm not talking about exclusively the Israel lobby, of course. I'm talking about the Pelosi's. I'm talking about the Reids. I'm talking about the people who think they can kind of bend with the wind and sacrifice the lives of 1,500 more U.S. soldiers and Marines. The poet Dante said that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who remain neutral in times of crisis. Now, I Googled hell yesterday, and I want to tell you that it was hotter in hell yesterday than it was in Crawford, Texas last August. That's pretty hot. So let's mind our P's and Q's. Let's get out there and act like what we are, namely more of us than there are of them. Thank you.
I'm going to address two issues. The first being the war on terror, and the second being the consequences of expanding the conflict in the Middle East towards Iran. And I want to preface my comments by saying that I spent almost 20 years abroad as a foreign correspondent, 15 of those years with the New York Times. I worked in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, where I spent 7 years. I'm an Arabic speaker. And finally, the Balkans. I covered the war in Sarajevo and Kosovo. I probably hit about 50 countries in the course of my tenure abroad, everything from the civil war in Yemen and the Sudan to the declaration of martial law after '91 in Algeria and the insurgency there, to the Punjab, Kashmir, and after 9/11, I was assigned by the New York Times to cover Al-Qaeda. I was based in Paris, and I worked in Europe and the Middle East. Those immediate weeks after 9/11, for someone who was traveling both in Europe and the Middle East, were extremely significant because the attacks appalled the rest of the world. The crimes against humanity that were committed in 9/11 engendered tremendous amounts of shame and revulsion, not only among our European allies, but among the Muslim world, who constitute 1/5 of the world's population, most of whom, I remind you, are not Arab. The only way to fight terrorism is to isolate terrorist groups within their own society. And the attacks of 9/11 had gone a very long way to accomplishing that goal. Osama bin Laden and his small, relatively disorganized band of cohorts were reviled throughout the Middle East. Sheikh Tantawi, the highest religious authority in Al-Azhar, the great seat of Islamic learning in Cairo, denounced the attacks for what they were, as a crime against humanity, and then went on to denounce Osama bin Laden as a fraud, someone who had no theological training and no right, therefore, to issue religious edicts known as fatwas. Unfortunately, what did we do as a country? We folded in on ourselves. We drank from the very dark elixir of American nationalism. And I remind you that the flip side of nationalism is racism. When you exalt yourself above others, you inherently denigrate those who are not with you. You saw it in the way we referred to and spoke about Muslims, the way we referred to and spoke about our allies, the French, who share our values, and who told us at the inception of this conflict that there were no weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein was not reconstituting a nuclear weapons program, and he had no links with Al-Qaeda. And what did we do? We denigrated French culture, French identity, French being. Our response became one of waging a conventional war, or attempting to wage a conventional war against a non-conventional target. Wars against terrorist groups are wars of intelligence, wars of shadows. Covering the French, who, at least according to French intelligence, were the only foreign government to actually have infiltrated human assets inside of Al-Qaeda. The way that they stopped the Paris embassy, which was quite extensive, an attempt to bomb the U.S. embassy in Paris, was through those who had managed to infiltrate in the group and tip them off. Dropping iron fragmentation bombs all over Afghanistan, and then, of course, Iraq, not only did nothing to mitigate the threat that comes from these small terrorist groups, but, of course, remove that pariah status. And I watched over the weeks that I covered Al-Qaeda and months, I watched them be resurrected as an organization, because of the folly of our foreign policy and the absolute inability that the greatest strength that we could have found after 9/11 was the courage to be vulnerable. That if we had built on that empathy, we would be far safer and more secure today than, of course, we are at the moment. We now face a situation where this administration is seriously contemplating a war against Iran. As someone who has spent a lot of time in the Middle East and a lot of time in Iran, an attack on Iran would have catastrophic consequences throughout the Middle East and most probably ignite a regional conflict. We are already in the midst of a proxy conflict with Iran through confrontations with Hezbollah, Hamas, and then, of course, with the Shiite insurgency in Iraq. There are purportedly teams of special ops units inside Iran finding target acquisitions. All reports are that an assault against Iran would be aerial through cruise missiles, conventional airstrikes, possibly bunker busters. The feeling among the policy planners is that an attack on Iran would ignite a popular uprising against the mullahs who control the country and who are indeed immensely unpopular. Unfortunately, I can assure you that dropping cruise missiles and iron fragmentation bombs all over Iran will be seen by Shiites throughout the region as an assault against Shiism. There are 2 million Shiites in Saudi Arabia, most of whom, or many of whom, work in the oil sector. Bahraini is Shia. Of course, there's a Shiite majority in Iraq. Hezbollah is Shia. And there's a huge Shia minority in Pakistan. The Straits of Hormuz would most certainly be shut down. The Iranians have enough silkworm missiles to make that possible. And let's not forget that we have 2 battle carrier groups that are now crowded in that narrow space. Many people think that the Bush administration is sitting or placing them there to perhaps even provoke an incident that then would allow them to carry out these strikes. There's very little doubt in my mind that the Shiite forces, certainly Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, would respond. Israel, if it was not actively involved in the attack, of course, which would be a disastrous consequence, will be seen as a legitimate target. Iran does not have the capacity to attack the United States with conventional weapons. It does have the capacity to strike against Israel. Israel would certainly strike back. This could unleash a scenario that comes close to the scenario of Armageddon that many of President Bush's most fervent supporters yearn for. Unfortunately, the consequences for us are going to be devastating. I think, from my reading of this administration, that the possibility of a strike against Iran before President Bush leaves office are high. The reason is that, from everything I can tell, this administration has adopted a corruption of Leon Trotsky's permanent revolution. Only it's permanent war. But it serves the same purpose. It is an administration that does not use the instruments of diplomacy. It speaks to the rest of the world exclusively in the language of violence. Permanent revolution, as formulated by Trotsky, keeps both domestic and foreign opponents off balance. It is an effective tool to cow dissidents, both inside and outside your own country. And at a time when there is growing unease with the Bush administration and its foreign policy, certainly the war in Iraq, whipping up that nationalist fervor is, I think, an effective, unfortunately, counterweight to the malaise that is gripping our society and the political process. And it works. I've watched it in country after country after country. That euphoria of nationalism is one that suspends critical judgment. It is appealing. It creates a kind of comradeship, a feeling of belonging, a sense of empowerment. When you think back, for instance, on the lead up to the war in Iraq, what did the coverage on the cable news channels, who, by the way, sold us the war and now no longer cover it because it doesn't fit that mythic paradigm that advertisers like? What is it that they talked about? They talked about our weaponry. They brought in retired military who talked about the power of our cruise missiles and, of course, by extension, our own power. And what I fear is that rather than this policy being seen through the transparent manipulation that it is, or for the transparent manipulation that it is, once again, people will pull American flags out and wave them out of the cars and drive up and down the street and begin that kind of herd-like chant of American greatness. Finally, to close, don't expect much from the Democratic Party. I think it's instructive that the only Democratic figure that I know of, and maybe Ray can correct me on this, who has gotten up to oppose going after a major Democratic figure, going after Iran is Dennis Kucinich. Everyone else has, by their silence or by their sort of tacit acceptance, signed on for a project that has the possibility of bringing to our country not only a conflict that could unravel and create a kind of hydra-headed monster that we can no longer control in the Middle East, but of course ultimately something that will be brought to our own shores as well. Let's remember, an unprovoked attack against Iran under international law allows the Iranians, or gives the Iranians, the right to strike back, and the only way they can strike back on American soil is essentially through acts of terrorism. Thank you.
One of the very first courses I took in graduate school, the professor, who was actually a venerable conservative, said in class in passing that if there's one country one should never think of invading is Iraq. Now, he wasn't being prophetic. This was in 1964. He would never imagine that fellow conservatives would invade Iraq. But he was actually speaking from personal experience of the 1920s when the British had invaded Iraq and had found actually what we're finding now, that Iraq is real hell. Not just hell in an unpleasant place, but a hell with real no exit. The British, as soon as they invaded, found a resistance, guerrilla warfare. The only way they could deal with it was massive bombing of civilians, even using gas. Yes, Saddam Hussein was not the first person to introduce use of gas on civilians. He learned it from the British. The British dragged it out. In fact, the whole invasion was in the British government known as Churchill's Big Folly. It drained British resources. It helped undermine the British Empire. And incidentally, the British really never got out of Iraq. They were booted out, and their puppets who were set up there were literally dragged through the streets. Their bodies were dragged through the streets. And the net result of the British experiment in Iraq was, in fact, in the long run, the rise of the Ba'ath Party and Saddam Hussein. So this is basically the lesson of Iraq, which the professor was talking about. Yet when we came to the whole discussion of whether we should invade Iraq or not, this lesson of history was not brought up at all in the media or in Washington. So what today I want to look at is the question, why was this ignored? Why did we rush headlong into hell with eyes wide shut? I'm not doing it just purely as an experiment, historical lesson or historical question, because the same mentality that led us to Iraq, the same mentality exists very much, and it could lead to very much the same type of disasters in future. And I think what's happening now in Iran about Iran is really having learned nothing about Iraq and a repetition of the same thing. The usual easy answer for why they made this mistake would be to say, well, they were stupid. In fact, the chief of staff, when he was talking about Elliot Abrams, one of the masterminds of the invasion, he called him the most stupidest man he's ever met. And I'm sure the feeling was mutual. But really, you can't dismiss the whole problem by saying they were all stupid. By any yardstick we use, these were the brightest and the best of American society. People like Cheney, Rumsfeld, the people running the Pentagon, by no stretch of the imagination, are stupid. In fact, this makes it more of a problem, because if these are the brightest and the best, how does the average American think, and what is their way of mentality? Let's not forget that 70% of the American public actually thought it was a good idea to go into Iraq. Another interpretation of the big mistake is that the invasion was not well prepared, the occupation was not well prepared. This has become sort of the conventional wisdom, especially by journalists who originally supported the invasion. I'm thinking people like Packard, who say, well, the original idea was good, but somehow if they had planned it better, if they had done this or that, things would have been different and it would have been a success. If you think about it, actually, this is absolute nonsense. There's, in the annals of history, there's never been an invasion, an occupation better prepared than this one. If you look back, it was nothing hidden in the newspapers. For a whole year before the invasion, in Washington, there were actually 17 separate committees, over 100 people working full-time on planning on how to actually run the occupation. They had blueprints on how to privatize the oil industry, how to privatize the 20 factories that existed in Iraq, how to privatize even health. The Ba'athist regime had set up a national health system. They were going to privatize that. They had actually blueprints for everything. Cheney was walking around with actually maps of where all the oil wells were and what they were going to do. They had even, you can see it in the New York Times, there were conferences for big business on how to invest. Small businesses, separate conferences for small businesses. Cheney was telling that the coalition of the willing that there was a room on the table for anyone who came, as if Iraq was going to be a feast where the obliging would get a seat at the table. So this was as well planned and micromanaged as you can imagine. These were CEOs who really sat down and planned everything. So it's not the planning that didn't work, it's the actual reality. How far was their planning in touch with reality? In fact, one of a few people in the Pentagon who was familiar with the Middle East, General Zinni, when he had seen some of these plans, he said, in fact, the quote, these people who are dreaming up these plans have inhabited a different planet from us. They're completely living in a different world. Now, the question then becomes, how could intelligent people draw up these plans yet be completely divorced from reality? How does one explain this? Well, one, I think, explanation is there, from what they have themselves said. Here is a quotation from a White House official. We are not bound by facts, by history, and by reality. We make our own history, our own reality, our own facts. i.e., it doesn't really matter what Iraq is like. Iraq is a blank slate. They're like the invisible men. We can just go in, reshuffle the things as we want, and produce what we want. The people at the other end really don't matter. We have the power. We can make the world as we like it. And you find some of the vignettes, true vignettes, that actually illustrate the mentality. There was a panel discussion at Georgetown just before the invasion. And on the panel discussion was Doug Feit, who was one of the architects of the venture, and an official from the State Department. And Doug Feit said, oh, the whole thing would be easy. It's like dealing with a computer. You just go in, take out the disk, which would be Saddam Hussein, you put Chinchelabi, and everything would be fine. It would be a cinch. You find almost anyone you talk to who was involved in it, the idea was as simple as that. If you look at Garner, who was the first proconsul appointed before the invasion in March, he was already set up a committee in Kuwait on how they were going to run the whole system. And he assured his cabinet there that they would be out of Iraq by September. Some wise guy at the back of the hall said, which September? We don't know. He was probably exiled to Nebraska or somewhere for the rest of his life. You also find PowerPoints at the Pentagon given that within 6 months, U.S. would have just 5,000 troops left there. The whole issue would be solved. Sort of the committees that were set up, in fact, to plan the future of Iraq had even a flag, what the new flag was going to be like. Down from here in Washington Square, there was a committee who drafted the constitution for the new Iraq. And I heard one of the drafters giving a talk at the Graduate Center who said, oh, well, we have a federal system where we'll allow this to the Sunnis, this to the Shias, and everyone will be happy. Again, someone from the back of the hall said, you think these Iraqis are guinea pigs, they're going to do just what you like. Once you get there, all hell will break loose. You dismiss the whole thing. No, 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 we know how to arrange everything. So these were the plans there, but the reality was in fact very different. They were not interested in the reality of what Iraq would be like. They had their plans and they were going to implement. In fact, once US got there, they discovered, in fact, the reality was very different. I know nowadays the talk is, well, if the military was not disbanded, if this and that was done, things would have been different. The military was not actually disbanded by mistake. This was, again, calculated, part of the very much designed, micromanaged system. If you were going to win over the Shias, that was the way to do it. There was that main demand of the Shias was the disbanding of the army. So it wasn't a mistake, it was part of the strategy. The problem was the strategy was all wrong because the whole idea of invasion of Iraq was wrong. There's an incident that really shows the unraveling of the US position, I would say, when reality hit the fan, which is precisely 2 weeks after the invasion. An incident, incidentally, which the American press hardly covered, but if you look at the European press, they understood the significance of this. In 2 weeks after the invasion, the Shia Ayatollahs called for a big meeting in Karbala. And the Financial Times said they came in the hundreds, they came in the thousands, in the 10,000s, they came in the millions. And the whole sight, they said, was unnerving. These were people, even barefoot people, walking for 20, 30 miles to go to Karbala. They weren't going there just on a pilgrimage. They were going there to show, in fact, the world who they supported, which was their religious leaders. So the Americans had the guns, but the streets were really in the hands of the Ayatollahs. So when the US then came and in fact furled the flag, the wonderful flag, people actually recognized it was modeled on the Israeli flag. What could be more unrealistic than to bring to a flag that's really designed on the Israeli to an Arab country? They considered it obviously an insult. And when the U.S. brought the Constitution, which the NYU had nicely drafted for them, the Shia Ayatollah said, "Thank you very much. We're quite capable of drawing up our own Constitution. We will have our elections for the Constituent Assembly." And that's where, in fact, the whole issue of democracy came in. It wasn't something that the administration in Washington was thinking about. This is what the Ayatollahs forced on the United States to have the elections. In fact, once you have elections in a society that's very sectarianly divided and have an electoral system that aggravates the divisions between that, we've resulted what we have now, which is basically Sunnis and Shias cutting throats, which had never existed in Iraq before. Sorry. So the question then becomes, how does this sort of refusal to look at reality come from? Well, I think one clear answer to that is really imperial hubris. The notion that really United States controls the world, reality doesn't matter. Now, where does this come from? I think it's part and parcel of American history. The Cold War, in a way, restrained this for a while because there was a counterbalancing force that limited U.S. in flexing its muscles. But with the other superpower gone, U.S. can act out, basically, its chauvinistic instincts. But another, I think, point here that sort of adds to that, I'll end on. If you look at most of the architects of the Iraqi enterprise, they came from Central American experiment, where the United States had gone in, shuffled things around. If people resisted, then they got death squads, mass killings like in Guatemala, and eventually the U.S. seemed successful. So when in Iraq things didn't work out the way they wanted, in fact, they started talking about the El Salvador solution or the Central American solution, which is a polite way of saying death squads and mass killings. The problem in Iraq is that U.S. has met its match. People in Iraq are quite capable of having their own death squads. They can actually deal with the United States on the same level of mass murder and terror. And here, of course, we're not dealing with just local, one small, tiny states. We're dealing with basically an Arab country with 230 million Arabs throughout the region, people who are willing to volunteer to go and fight. Plus the fact that in Iraq, it's not just nationalism, it's very much nationalism reinforced by religion, which makes it a very potent force. So the net result is that here I think the U.S. has really found itself something with more than it can chew. It's not Central America, it's really the Middle East. I'll stop there.
Thank you. A wonderful panel. We want to have an opportunity for people to ask some questions. And there's a mic here. So do come up, and as you probably all know, this is on C-SPAN. So to come up to ask some questions of anyone on the panel for that microphone. Is anyone going to come? Let me just while you're getting your nerve up. Let me ask whether there's anything between the panel members. Anything you want?
There's just one comment that I wanted to make. I was in Central America for 5 years and covered El Salvador, Guatemala, and the Contra War in Nicaragua, in which, of course, Elliot Abrams was a key figure. I think that the rights or wrongs of it, we can debate another time. But in fact, the counterinsurgency effort that was undertaken in El Salvador was successful. The FMLN rebel forces in El Salvador were the most advanced rebel army ever created, maybe with the exception now of the FARC, but up until that time in the history of Latin America, dwarfed anything that we saw in Nicaragua or Cuba. And they did it by quite astutely, and most of the people running this had come out of Vietnam. We'd go up to the Sheraton, and they'd all be having lunch with their Vietnamese wives. They understood the mistakes that they'd made. They knew that they had to do it through an indigenous force, so that the death squads in countries like Guatemala or El Salvador were in fact indigenous. They weren't imposed by the United States. They were supported, funded, protected by the United States, but they grasped in a way that the architects of the war in Iraq didn't, that in order to defeat an insurgency, they had to hide behind the scenes. And that, of course, is, I think, the great disaster that they've made in Iraq, that they, by the time they got to Baghdad, it was clear to all of Iraq that there was a throwback to a kind of colonial occupation, and we were doomed. I think, probably, days, if not a couple weeks after the invasion.
Okay. The only thing I caution is be sure to ask a question. Okay.
Right. Thank you for the teach-in, and it reminds me of the Vietnam War days when there were teach-ins all over the campuses. My question is about the U.S. link with Israel, and the fact that Jimmy Carter wrote his book, which has gotten a lot of attention in a way that the John Mearsheimer piece didn't. But when Mearsheimer, and for those of you that don't know about it, he's at Chicago University, and he wrote a piece together with somebody from Harvard, which couldn't get published here. I think that was in 2003, talking about the connections between the U.S. and Israel forming the basis for so much of our foreign policy. It was published in Britain, and then the quote from somebody at Harvard was that their endowment went into free fall as a result of the article being published. Now Jimmy Carter has sort of spoken about the elephant. Okay, sorry for it's addressed to Mr. McGovern. Don't you think that with Jimmy Carter really tackling this elephant in the room, that there will be more and more publicity? It's like he's going to bear the brunt of it, but that more and more will come out, and that will reveal the need to change our policy. It cannot just be about oil, cannot just be about Israel and protecting our enclave in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I do believe that Jimmy Carter showed great courage in sticking his neck out and telling it like it is. He has engendered an open conversation on this now, and I think that's all to the good. I also think that, the Israel lobby is not representative of American Jews or of even Israeli Jews. It is a small right-wing faction like the Likudniks in Israel. Most American Jews don't have any truck with the AIPAC type of thing. Now, it's kind of complicated to explain how it is that AIPAC is so powerful, but it still is. But there is a growing realization among American Jews, and just read forward to see it, that backlash is a really, really a potent threat. In other words, if our young men and women get sent to do battle with Iran on the justification that Iran could possibly have a nuclear weapon early to mid next decade, which is the intelligence assessment, hello, that leaves a lot of time to negotiate with these folks. Who is Iran a threat to? Well, it won't be a leap of imagination to realize that the Israelis feel very threatened by one nuclear weapon in the hands of Iran, whereas most people probably know that Israel has 200 to 300 nuclear weapons deliverable by air, sea, and land. Okay, so it's a growing awareness that has been engendered by Jimmy Carter and Mearsheimer and Walt and the others, and I look for a respectful conversation where the elephant can be taken out of the living room and addressed for what it's worth.
Let me just comment. I covered Yitzhak Rabin, who couldn't stand groups like AIPAC, because what had happened before Rabin became prime minister is that they had become arms of Likud. And then, of course, now it's incarnation in Kadima. And when Rabin was inaugurated as prime minister, he didn't invite any of these figures to his inauguration. And there's a famous story of him going to Washington and being told that AIPAC and other leaders wanted to meet him, and he said, "I'm not going to meet with those scumbags," or whatever the Hebrew equivalent of it is. And the notion that they represent Israel's interests is a fallacy. They represent the most rapacious, messianic, right-wing interests of Israel. It's as if we had a powerful lobbying organization in Israel that served the interests of the neocons and the Bush administration and claimed to represent American interests.
Yeah, okay, I have to warn you, we can't go on too long with questions, but quickly, Richard, yeah.
This question or this issue of folly, how can intelligent people draw up these plans and be completely divorced from reality? I'm thinking of Douglas Haig in July 1916, sending the men into the machine gun fire. It failed. They did it for another 2 years. I'm thinking Hitler attacking Russia in the midst of attacking Great Britain. Don't you think our critique at this point in human history has to go a little farther, and we have to begin to abandon the very assumption of rationality, or that people who engage in war know what they're doing? And isn't this really the starting point, not the ending point? How can intelligent people draw up these plans that are so completely divorced from reality, and then we begin a psychological analysis of that very question about the fantasy of war and the irrationality of war?
Well, you know, I wrote a book called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning that addresses precisely that point. And I think the best way to understand it is perhaps to turn to Freud, who talked about the two most powerful forces being eros, that instinct to preserve, protect life, and what he called the thanatos, or the death instinct, that instinct towards the annihilation of all living things, including ourselves. And I think that when you get caught up in the intoxication of war, I think war, having spent years of my life in the midst of it, is the most powerful narcotic invented by humankind. There is a willful acceptance of self-annihilation. I saw it in Bosnia, and you're precisely right. It is, for me anyway, not a matter of not understanding reality, but being so gripped by the fervor and passion and allure of violence and war that one is willing to accept even their own destruction. That certainly bears out with my own coverage of roughly a dozen conflicts over the last 20 years.
Okay. And the motivation
Richard.
for self-annihilation.
One more question. Sorry, we'll come back.
A reference was made as to the efficacy of infiltration as opposed to traditional military tactics. And my question for Mr. McGovern is, what percentage approximately of CIA agents speak fluent Arabic, not Fusha, but the local Amiya dialects, and how many of those are recruited from dissident communities?
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to punt there. I've been out of the agency for so long. They have made some measurable progress on that. I understand they're trying. It's still a very, very low percentage. If you have 1,000 people at the U.S. Embassy built to the cost of $1 billion in Baghdad, my latest information is only a handful of those people actually speak Arabic.
Right. All right, last question.
Quick question. War and its cost is the title of the panel. What I would like from any one of you is to get a sense from your perspective of how many Iraqis have died, how many Iraqis have been maimed, how many Iraqis have been displaced. With regards to our own troops, we get a daily count, whether that's real or not, of the numbers that have died and the numbers who have been maimed by war. So,
the Lancet report, which is now actually about a year old, their estimate was somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000. That didn't get much coverage. The only reason it got coverage was when people criticized and said it was faulty. Then it got coverage that it was faulty. But the actual report in Lancet did not get much coverage here. Now, if you look at it, actually, even if you take the lower estimate, 400,000, the methodology used is the same methodology. It's the same people using it who used it in Rwanda and Bosnia. So if their methodology is faulty in Iraq, then it's faulty in the other cases, then we shouldn't be using the other figures either. But what people I've talked to say that actually it sounds like a fairly conservative figure of 400,000 to 600,000 Iraqi deaths. But that's, again, out of date. So by now it's probably reaching 700, 800,000.
I think the UN estimates there's 1.5 million people who've been displaced, you know, right? Yeah, I think it's 1.5 million and about 600,000, according to Lancet.
I would just add a riff on that. I mean, I think the Lancet report, which is a medical report in Britain, and the method was the most sophisticated epidemiological kind of work, and the 400,000 to 600,000, give or take 100,000 if you want. At the same time, the Bush administration was saying that only 40,000 Iraqis had died. That was the official government. That's what was being put out.
Yeah, Chuck, it wasn't only Lancet in Britain, it was Johns Hopkins University, okay? A relatively reputable university, until recently at least. And, you know, I find it bizarre to be arguing about whether it's, I mean, we have to address the question, but if, does anybody want to say it's only 20,000 or it's only 100,000? These are people who would be alive today were it not for our invasion of Iraq. Whether it's 100,000, 20,000, that's an awful lot of people. And we do well to acknowledge that and, you know, in religious terms, repent, and in realpolitik terms, change course.
Excellent. Thank you. It's been an excellent panel. In the tradition of teach-ins, we're just going to, it's fluid. So if this panel is ended, and if Damon Mullins and Carolyn Eisenberg would come up, we'll move right into the next step. Thank you all very much.